Fish O3. Wisdom, knowledge, and truth. Philosophy defined. Philosophy is the predilection for wisdom, normally encapsulated within a formal academic discipline. Wisdom is the soundness of an action or a decision, with regard to the application of experience, knowledge, insight, and good judgment. Wisdom may also be described as the body of knowledge and the principles that develop within a specified society or period. For example, the sage wisdom of the Tibetan Lamas. Etymologically, the word originates from the Greek, philosophia, meaning, love of wisdom, and is the systematized study of general and fundamental questions, such as those about existence, reason, knowledge, values, ethics, mind, and language. Some sources claim the term was coined by Pythagoras. Philosophical methods include questioning, critical discussion, rational argument, and systematic presentation. Philosophers generally divide their field into the two kingdoms, the Eastern branch, which covers the entire Asian continent, and the Western branch of philosophy, which includes mainly European, though in recent centuries, embraces American and Australian-born philosophers also. Furthermore, each of these two kingdoms can be loosely divided into lesser branches of philosophy, such as the Continental Analytical Division within Western philosophy, and the various schools of epistemology of India, China, and Middle East Asia, some of which are outlined below. Genuine wisdom. Unfortunately, in most cases in which the term philosophy is used, particularly outside of ancient Indian philosophical traditions, it tacitly or implicitly refers to ideas and/or ideologies that are quite far removed from genuine wisdom. For instance, the typical academic philosopher, especially in the Western tradition, is not a lover of actual wisdom, but a believer in, or at least a practitioner of, a dharma, lawlessness, which is the antithesis of genuine wisdom. Many Western academic, so-called, philosophers, are notorious for using laborious sophistry, abstruse semantics, gobbledygook, and/or pseudo-intellectual wordplay, in an attempt to justify their blatantly immoral ideologies and practices, and in many cases, fooling the ignorant layman into accepting the most horrendous crimes, as not only normal and natural, but holy and righteous. In the sixth book of the Republic, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotles, commonly known as Plato, when discussing the poor reputation of philosophers and their apparent uselessness to the state, quotes his mentor, Socrates, as asserting that the best beltistoi in Greek philosophers, in actual fact, are not but useless, utter rogues, in stark contrast to true alethanoi in Greek philosophers, who are lovers of wisdom and truth. To be fair, Socrates argues that even the best, noblest philosophers become useless, akrestoi, in Greek to the state because the state itself is corrupt and does not utilize them properly, not because the philosophers themselves are useless. In the view of this author, an ideal philosopher, on the other hand, is one who is sufficiently intelligent to understand that morality, of necessity, is based on the law of non-violence, ahimsa, in Sanskrit, and sufficiently wise to live his or her life in such a harmless manner. Ch. 12 regarding morality. The repository of wisdom. One of the very greatest misunderstandings of modern times is the belief that philosophers, and psychologists, especially, are effectively the substitutes for the priesthood of old. It is perhaps understandable that this misconception has arisen in the popular mind, because the typical priest, monk, rabbi, mullah seems to be an unschooled buffoon, compared with those highly educated gentlemen who have attained collegiate doctorates in philosophy, psychology, psychiatry, etc. However, as mentioned in more than a few places in this book, it is imperative to understand that only a minuscule percentage of all those who claim to be spiritual teachers are actual Brahmana, as defined in Chapter 20. Therefore, the wisest philosophers of the present age are still those exceptionally rare members of the holy priesthood. Anyone who doubts this averment need do nothing more than read the remaining chapters of this sacred scripture, in order to learn this palpably obvious fact. Popular philosophers. At the very moment these words of mine are being typed on my laptop computer, there are probably hundreds of essay papers, as well as books and articles, being composed by professional philosophers and theologians, both within and without academia. None of these papers, and almost none of the papers written in the past, will have any noticeable impact on human society, at least not in the realm of morals and ethics, which is obviously the most vital component of civilization. And, as mentioned in a previous paragraph, since such lovers of wisdom are almost exclusively adharmic, irreligious, and corrupt, it is indeed fortuitous that this is the case. The only so-called philosophers who seem to have any perceptible influence in the public arena are pop or armchair philosophers, such as Mrs. Elisa Alice O'Connor, known more popularly by her pen name, Ayn Rand, and the British author, Mr. Clive Staples, C.S. Lewis, almost definitely due to the fact that they have published well-liked books, and/or they have managed to promulgate their ideas via the mass media, especially on the World Wide Web. Academic philosophers. In order to proffer merely one example of literally tens of thousands, of the assertion made in the previous paragraph, the 1905 essay paper by the famed British mathematician, philosopher and logician, Bertrand Russell, entitled, On Denoting, was described by one of his most notable contemporaneous colleagues, Frank P. Ramsey, as that paradigm of philosophy. Notwithstanding the fact that well under 1% of the populace would be able to even comprehend the essay, it is littered with spelling, grammar, punctuation, and syntactic errors, and it contains at least a couple of flawed propositions. Even if the average person was able to grasp the principles presented in that paper, it would not make any tangible impact on the human condition. Currently, this planet of ours is doomed to devastation, due to moral decay and environmental degradation, and such overintellectualizing essay papers can do nothing at all to help improve our deeply harrowing, frightful, and lamentable predicament, especially those papers that deal with exceedingly trivial subject matters, as does Russell's paper, An Argument for an Acutely Abstruse Concept in Semantics. The fact that Russell's aforementioned essay paper falls under the category of philosophy of language, and the fact that he was a highly cultured peer of the House of Lords, in the Parliament of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, yet his own writings being composed using far from perfect English, serves only to prove my assertion that philosophy ought to be restricted to genuine members of the holy priesthood. Furthermore, that Bertrand was fully intoxicated with adharmic, leftist ideologies and practices, including sexual licentiousness and socialism, even supporting Herr Adolf Hitler's Nazism, to some extent indicates that he was no lover of actual wisdom. The fact that, after thousands of years following the publication of Plato's Republic, not a single nation, nor a single country on this planet, has thought it wise to accept Plato's advice to promote a philosopher king, Raja Rc, in Sanskrit, as the head of its social structure, more than adequately proves my previous assertions. Unfortunately, however, both Plato and his student, Aristotle, were themselves hardly paragons of virtue, since the former was an advocate of infanticide, whilst the latter favored carnism, even stating that animal slaughter is mandatory. To my knowledge, the only philosopher in the Western academic tradition who was truly wise, was the German, Arthur Schopenhauer, since he espoused a reasonably accurate metaphysical position, as well as adhering to the law, that is, the one and only law, known as Dharma, in Bharata to a greater degree than most other Westerners. Hopefully, someday, I'll discover another philosopher, without India, to join Arthur. A case study. Because there are literally tens of thousands of bogus, academic, philosophers, who adhere to the above misconception of what is an actual philosopher, I am loath to nominate a single person of whom to make mention. However, because the former University of Oxford scholar, Mr. Colin McGinn, claims to be the best philosopher in the history of humanity, a claim he has repeatedly made on his own website, I therefore have no reservations about using this fool as an ideal example for my position in relation to academic philosophers. In order to preface this case study, it should be noted that Mr. McGinn's area of expertise is in the philosophy of mind, and he has written extensively on the subject. However, near the beginning of a videographed dialogue posted on the internet, Colin admitted that he was unable to even proffer a cogent definition of the word mind. The fact that Colin garnered a Master of Arts degree in psychology from a prominent English university did not seem to help with his understanding of the mind, despite the fact that psychology is concerned entirely with the psyche. I am quite certain that there are several teenagers in Bharata, India, who understand the topic more clearly than does Mr. McGinn, since they have been trained in Vedanta, see that glossary entry. In fact, there is very little doubt in my mind that my precocious youngest daughter, Sita Anna, would have much more fully understood the concepts of mind and consciousness, by the time she had reached the age of 10 years, had she not been effectively kidnapped by a devilishly wicked, evil, demonic, violent, criminal organization, known as the Federal Government of Australia. In the same video, McGinn claimed that homosexuality was not immoral, for the reason that most persons, though I am sure that he meant most persons in the decadent Western countries, accept perverse sexuality to not be immoral. A very blatant example of the logical fallacy known as the argumentum ad populum, appeal to popularity argument. Also, Mr. McGinn claims to be a supporter of animal rights, although whether or not he is a genuine vegan, is unknown at the time of writing this chapter, since he has either not received the emails that I have sent to him, or else, he has not bothered to reply to any of them. At the risk of sounding presumptuous, I would guess that he is not an actual vegan, judging by my vast experience in the so-called vegan community on the internet. Very few of those who claim to be vegan are, in fact, vegan, sad to say. Most are either plant-based eaters, in other words, definitionally strict vegetarians, or else they do not adhere to the correct definition of the word veganism, as coined by Mr. and Mrs. Donald Watson, and when asked for a definition of the term, in virtually every case, tender a rather inaccurate explanation of what constitutes veganism. Is it possible to be a vegan if one does not know what is a vegan? Yes, indeed it is, but highly improbable, since only one who resides in a very remote region of Earth would be unfamiliar with the word. Apart from his claim to be the greatest philosopher in history, Colin believes that his writing style to be among the clearest of any philosopher in history, despite his articles and books containing copious syntactic and vocabulary errors. There are a number of other truly idiotic remarks and assertions of Mr. McGinn that I could quote, such as his inane positions on free will, metaphysics, and politics, but those of mentioned above, should be sufficient to convince an actual philosopher of his abject ignorance in relation to all branches of philosophy and psychology. Furthermore, Mr. Colin McGinn's books on morality and ethics would have seemed far more authoritative if he had refrained from sexually harassing one of his female graduate students, during his tenure at the University of Miami. Rather tangentially, I have personally sent emails to literally hundreds of academic philosophers, most all of them, professors at major Western tertiary education institutions, yet not a single one of them, including Mr. McGinn, has accepted my generous offer of a free electronic copy of this book, a final instruction sheet for humanity. Just see how incredibly closed-minded are the so-called thought leaders of our society. I honestly believe that the problem with these academic philosophers is that they are members of the working class, which implies that it is their nature to work for a living, whereas actual philosophers are members of the most holy priesthood, who, by definition, do not work, but who are impelled to teach truth to humanity, with no regard of the cost to themselves. In my own case, I have been subsisting entirely providentially for almost 4 decades. Philosophy in abstract. In summary, those who are known as philosophers, whether they are members of an academic body, such as a university faculty professor, or otherwise, in virtually each and every case, are what I would call highly intelligent fools, meaning one who has an intellectual capacity greatly beyond the norm, yet, due to being afflicted with an adharmic, i.e. an evil, immoral, demonic mentality, are bereft of genuine wisdom. Just to append an additional anecdote of my above assertion, a female philosophy professor from an American university responded to my email to her with a curt, impetuous slur, rather than addressing the contents of the email, chapters 25 and 26 of this book. How exceedingly presumptuous of me, to assume that a highly qualified academic would present robust arguments against my position on the role of females in human society, and on feminism, rather than commit the logical fallacy of attacking her correspondent with insults. Obviously, I should be considered insane for suggesting that a woman, no matter her level of education, as well as the typical leftist man, for that matter, refrain from hysterics, upon being confronted with simple facts and rationality that contradict her objectively immoral and wicked social ideologies. Epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, that is, how we come to know the things we know. The concept of justified true belief states that, in order to know that a given proposition is true or accurate, one must not only believe the relevant proposition, but also have adequate justification for doing so, plus, of course, that the proposition is indeed true, without any false premises. The English philosophical expression, epistemology, originates from the Greek word, episteme, meaning knowledge, which is the feminine of epistemon, meaning, in turn, understanding. Knowing, from epistonai, which literally means to know, from the root verbs, epi plus histonai, meaning to place. Knowledge may be defined as mental objects that correspond to objective facts. Because absolute knowledge cannot be achieved by a relative being, such as we humans, knowledge, at best, is normally defined as justified true belief, although this has been shown to be necessarily imperfect, due to the philosophical conundrum known as the Gettier problem. Furthermore, the above definition does not disqualify knowledge of fictional stories, myths and legends. For example, if one was to assert that the legendary King Arthur of Great Britain was sired by Uther Pendragon, was befriended by the magician Merlin, was betrothed to Mistress Guinevere, owned a sword called Excalibur, and was laid to rest on the mythical island of Avalon, one would be correct according to the ancient tale, even if Arthur did not, in fact, exist. Otherwise, one could not claim to know anything of the narrative at all. See also, the entries, belief, and episteme, in the glossary of this holy book. Gettier cases. Many philosophers argue that the justified true belief account is the standard, widely accepted definition of knowledge. However, a relatively recent counterexample case, known as the Gettier problem, after the American philosopher, Drive. Edmund Lee Gettier, has shown this to be an imperfect epistemology. Therefore, a handful of philosophers have extended this tripartite analysis of knowledge, all of which have certain fundamental flaws, at least in the estimation of the author of this treatise. Ultimately, the only fact that one can truly know for certain is that one is extant, as opposed to knowing that one exists, since the word exist refers to an object apart from oneself. All other, ostensibly epistemological facts can never ever be conclusively proven, since no imperfect being can possibly possess perfect knowledge. Of course, one may counter thus, but it is theoretically possible that we are merely brains in a vat, or entrapped within a virtual existence of some kind. Yet, even so, the fact that we exist in some form, even if that form is not perfectly known by ourselves, or could ever be known, can never be doubted. Even if, as some contemporary philosophers suggest, consciousness is an illusion, there must be a subject who is witnessing the illusion, and therefore, actuality of some kind is assured. See the glossary entry, illusion, for a proper understanding of this tenuous term. Perhaps even the absolute, that is, pure being, conscious peace, or the impersonal ground of all being, lacks perfect knowledge. After all, the absolute could be said to be relative, at least, conceptually, because it exists in relation to the relative. However, this can be refuted, also. Absolute knowledge is unattainable. Because we humans are situated in the comparative, transactional sphere, with a greatly limited capacity for cognition, absolute knowledge is absolutely impossible. The only fact we can know for certain is the fact that we are aware of being aware. All other knowledge is necessarily imperfect, and cannot be completely reliable. Even if we were really just brains in a vat, or any similar scenario, there would still need be something or someone who makes the claim that we are aware of our own existence. Consequently, some unsound thinkers may contend, but then, this something or someone who claims to be existent is merely an illusion, it doesn't truly exist. To which the obvious rejoinder would be, then who or what is experiencing this supposed illusion? That would be the subject. A subject is that which perceives an object. So, the individual person, the I, recognizes, or is aware of, the self, the I, and this subject is able to cognize a host of variegated objects. This concept of what things can be known, absolutely, was arguably first introduced into Western thought by the 17th-century French mathematician and philosopher, Monsieur René Descartes, In his Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting One's Reason and of Seeking Truth in the Sciences, published in the year 1637, as a first step in demonstrating the attainability of definitive knowledge. The Latin dictum, cogito, ergo sum, which occurs in Part 4 of the work, and usually translated into English as, I think, therefore I am, is the first principle of Descartes' philosophy. He originally published it in French, as Je pense, donc je suis, so as to reach a wider audience than Latin would have allowed. It later appeared in Latin, in his Principia Philosophiae, Principles of Philosophy. Descartes believes three things are not susceptible to doubt, and these three support each other to form a stable foundation for his method. He cannot doubt that something has to be there to do the doubting, I think. Therefore, I am. The method of doubt cannot doubt reason, as it is based on reason itself. By reason there exists a God, and God is the guarantor that reason is not misguided. Of course, we know now that this logic is exceptionally flawed. Schools of epistemology. Some of the most popular schools of epistemology in the Western tradition include empiricism, rationalism, skepticism, pragmatism, relativism, probability theory, and idealism. Some of these schools have strong equivalences in the traditions of Bharatiya Indian philosophy. According to some authorities, specifically those in Bharatiya Indian philosophical traditions, there are, depending on the particular school in question, up to 6 proofs, or instruments of knowledge, or means of right information, pramana, in Sanskrit listed as follows. 1. Pratyaksa perception. Acquiring knowledge from experience, via sense perceptions and mental, intellectual acuity. 2. Anumana inference. Gaining right knowledge from logical conclusions, as far as human understanding allows. 3. Upamana comparison. Learning by observing similarities or analogies between two objects. 4. Arthapati postulation. Supposition of a fact to support a well-established fact. Derivation from circumstances. 5. Anupalabdhi non-apprehension. Understanding non-existence by non-perception, e.g. there is no such being as God. 6. Sabda verbal testimony. Gaining authentic knowledge from spoken and written testimony, composed by reliable authorities. Pramana forms one part of a trio of concepts that describe the ancient Bharatiya view on how knowledge is gained. The other two concepts are knower and knowable, each discussed in how they influence the knowledge, by their own characteristic and the process of knowing. These two concepts are called pramatar, the subject. The knower, and prameya, the object. The knowable, in the Sanskritam language. This triad of the knowledge, the knower, and the knowable, is very closely aligned with the tripartite process of seer seeing seen, mentioned in the 6th chapter of this holiest of all holy scriptures, in fact, the only truly sacred book extant, a final instruction sheet for humanity. The author of this book proposes that intuitive knowledge, gained from religious practices, such as meditation and peak experiences, is also of importance in regard to epistemology. This assertion is frequently justified when witnessing the highly intellectual discourses and debates of certain scientists and philosophers, who may display extravagant technical knowledge in their respective fields of study, yet lack the wisdom and common decency that ought to stem from a lifelong spiritual practice. See Chapter 16, regarding the 4 systems of yoga, or religion. Episteme must lead to veritas. Throughout human history, or at least for the past 10,000 years or so, philosophers, theologians, as well as laymen, have debated their peculiar epistemologies, in an attempt to discover truth. However, when all is said and done, that person who lives a life of negligible non-harm, ahimsa, in Sanskrit, even though his understanding of metaphysical reality may be quite imperfect, must surely have a greater insight into objective truth, than one who continually causes undue harm to himself, to society, to other living organisms, as well as to the inorganic environment. So, for example, the typical academic philosopher, particularly in the West, and especially since the 18th century, seems to support all kinds of immoral practices and ideologies, adharma, in Sanskrit. Assuming that the goal of philosophy is to discover truth and wisdom, in order to live a better life, one can only conclude that their knowledge and understanding of truth is fundamentally flawed. Therefore, one may have a wealth of intellectual knowledge and technical capability in the field of ethics, morality, epistemology, metaphysics, ontology, and logic, yet, if one's life is inebriated with a dharma criminal activity, that knowledge is of no practical benefit. In summary, that man who has found authentic peace within his own mind, and lives a life of minimal non-harm, has far greater knowledge, at least in the experiential realm, than an intellectual giant who lives a life of moral depravity. This attitude towards knowledge and wisdom has been termed pragmatism in recent centuries, though in all actuality, it is a very sound philosophical position, when one views the field of knowledge from a greater perspective. Meaning, the term pragmatism may seem unscientific, but factually speaking, it can be a highly rational field of study. How is knowledge gained? Knowledge about the world and about mental concepts is gained via the six senses. Why six senses? Because, oppositional to the typical Western understanding, ancient Bharatiya schools of philosophy classify the mind, or to be more specific, the intellectual facility of one's consciousness, known as buddhi, in Sanskrit, as the sixth sense. So, just as the eyes are instrumental for gaining knowledge of objects in the visual field, the mind intellect is responsible for discerning conceptual objects, not to mention the fact that the eyes are useless without the mind, in the first place. For example, when making mathematical calculations, the mind alone is all that is required to achieve the outcome. In the ancient Indian systems of metaphysics, known as Vedanta and Samkhya, mind is considered the sixth sense, although the five so-called external senses are, nonetheless, nominally distinguished from the mind, which is called an internal sense. This seems to be quite logical, because, just as the five outer senses involve a triad of experience, the perceived, the perception, and the perceiver, so too does the mind comprise a triad of cognition, the known, the knowing, and the knower. Even in common parlance, mind is often referred to as a sense, when we say, for instance, that person seems to have a sixth sense regarding the behavior of others. Or, how did you know the keys were in my bag? You must have a sixth sense. See also Chapter 06, in which the mind, the intellect, and the pseudo-ego are properly delineated. How to increase knowledge. My suggestions for gaining a greater measure of knowledge which, hopefully, leads to a more profound degree of wisdom, are as follows. 1. Above all, seek out those rare men who have achieved a high level of knowledge in their respective fields. Obviously, when one is merely a novice, one cannot be expected to identify those rare masters. Therefore, it may take a while to discover such men, please be patient. Fortuitously, there are many extant recordings and transcripts available on the internet, of the British-American philosopher, although he denigratingly referred to himself as an entertainer, Drive. Alan Watts, and one could do far worse than to attentively study his astute lectures. 2. When studying the teachings of such educators, especially in their public lectures, which may often be found on the internet, in the form of audio or audiovisual recordings, it is agonizingly important for one to listen to their locutions repeatedly, even tens of times, if necessary. This suggestion was key to my own intellectual development, and is actually a stage in the yoga of knowledge, Jnana Yoga, in Sanskrit. 3. If possible, ask the teachers questions about those points that may be unclear, but only after one has followed step number 2. There had been numerous occasions where I found it unnecessary to question a lecturer, due to my questions being answered upon re-listening to a particular lecture, multiple times. Of course, if the teacher happens to be deceased, this point is redundant. A living master is indispensable. 4. Although not directly concerned with the acquisition of knowledge, it is strongly suggested that one improve one's grammatical skills, whatever is one's language, since philosophy is predicated on abstract concepts, and without a first-rate grasp of at least one of the major world languages, it is possible that one may not succeed in one's goals of attaining enlightenment, especially if one intends to communicate metaphysical and dharmic concepts to others. It is suggested that one study English grammar, at the very least, and possibly even more importantly, English etymology, see that entry in the glossary, since the most important writings in philosophy, religion and related topics, were either composed in that language, or have the greatest selection of direct translations. Latin and Sanskrit are of ancillary significance. Good and bad. Good and bad are relative. What may be good or bad can vary according to temporal circumstances, and according to personal preferences. For example, there is absolutely no doubt that citrus fruits are a good source of nutrients for human beings. However, it may be bad for one to consume such beneficial foods, when one is experiencing certain illnesses, such as chronic dysentery. One man's food is another man's poison. Because of the relative nature of goodness, anything that is considered to be good must also be bad from a certain viewpoint, since the extent of goodness is determined by the purpose of the object in question. As demonstrated, citrus fruits can be either good or bad, depending on its use. Is drinking arsenic good or bad? Well, if one wishes to remain alive, it is obviously bad, but for one who wants to die, it is obviously good. However, beyond the dichotomy of good and bad, is the eternal truth, which transcends mundane relativism. Therefore, the accomplishment of life is to rise above the subjective, good and bad, and abide in the transcendental sphere. A qualified spiritual preceptor is able to guide one in the intricacies of such transcendence. Such a person, who has transcended mundane relative truth, is said to be an enlightened soul. The next subsection of this chapter, along with the relevant entries in the glossary, further explicates the concept of truth veritas, in Latin. When making moral judgments, it is immeasurably more appropriate to use the terms moral, amoral, and or immoral, rather than good, bad, or right, wrong. As the Bard of Avon so rightly declared in the script for one of his plays, there is nothing that is intrinsically either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. At the time of writing, early 21st century, especially in the Anglosphere, most persons seem to use the dichotomy of good, evil, instead of good, bad, and holy, evil, most probably because they consider that holiness is exclusively a religious term. However, the terms holy and righteous are fundamentally synonymous, for they refer to a person or an act that is fully in accordance with pure, holy, and righteous principles dharma, in Sanskrit. So, a holy person is one who obeys the law of non-harm, ahimsa, in Sanskrit, and as the ancient Sanskrit axiom states, ahimsa paramo dharma, non-violence is the highest moral virtue or law, and ahimsa param satyam, non-violence is the epitome of truth. See the Anusasana Parva of the epic, Mahabharata, 13.117.37-38. Of course, for a full disquisition of law, morality, ethics, dharma, one should carefully study the 12th chapter of this holiest of all holy books. Concepts versus truth. The word, truth, satyam, tathya, tattva, or siddhanta, in Sanskrit, is one of the most greatly misused terms in the English tongue. Anything that has ever been written or spoken, by even the greatest sage or avatara, incarnation of divinity, assuming such a phenomenon exists, see the glossary, for the most exacting definition of that Sanskrit word, including every single postulation delineated within this solitary holy scripture. A final instruction sheet for humanity is merely a concept, that is to say, it is an idea, or a notion, that belongs to the sphere of relative truth, and not the truth, full stop, period, at least not in the absolute sense of the term. Again, refer to the glossary. A concept is either accurate or inaccurate. Virtually all concepts are inaccurate to a degree. However, some concepts are far more accurate than others. For example, the personal conception of ultimate reality, God or the Goddess, is totally inaccurate, see Chapter 07. The concept of ultimate reality being an ideation of a mind, idealism, is far more accurate. The transcendence of both the above concepts, non-duality, is excruciatingly accurate. However, none of these concepts is the truth, as such, because all ideas are relative, whilst the truth is absolute. A belief is an unhealthy and somewhat problematic relationship one has with a certain concept or idea, due to misapprehension of life as it is, objectively speaking. Attachment to beliefs, particularly in the presumption of individual free will, is the cause of all psychological suffering. Relative truth versus absolute truth. It is vitally important to distinguish between relative truth and absolute truth. Relative truth is temporal, mutable, subjective, dependent, immanent, differentiated, conditioned, finite, complex, reducible, imperfect, and contingent, whilst absolute truth is eternal, immutable, objective, independent, transcendent, indifferentiated, unconditional, infinite, non-dual, that is, simple, irreducible, perfect, and necessary. Absolute truth is the ground of all being, Brahman, in Sanskrit, and is prior to any mind, matter, name, form, intent, thought, word, or deed. The only real truth in the phenomenal manifestation is the impersonal sense of being, that is, the sense of I am, aham, in Sanskrit. Everything else is merely transient and unreal, for that very reason, because it is ever mutating, lacking permanence and stability. This sense of haxiety is otherwise called infinite awareness, spirit, God, the ground of being, necessary existence, the higher self, as well as various other epithets, for it is the very essence of one's being. Chapters 06 and 10 deal more fully with this subject matter. Of course, for one who is fully self-realized and enlightened, the subject-object duality has collapsed. Therefore, a fully awakened individual does not perceive any real difference between himself and the external world, and so sees everything in himself, and himself in everything. So, whenever I hear philosophers, particularly those who subscribe to metaphysical schemas like idealism, speak of the distinction between the human person, perceiver, subject, self, I, and the supposedly external world, I sometimes respond thus: what is this external world of which you speak? Is not the discrete observer, the subject, indistinguishable from, or at least coexistent with the apparent field of objects? Otherwise, the mind itself would necessarily be external to the self, and thus, part of the external world, because it is possible for a person to say, I have stress in my mind. In this case, the mind is a possession of my, and therefore, the mind is an external object, external to I. Truth is unbearable. If it is true that there are none so blind as those who do not want to see, and none so deaf as those who do not want to hear, then surely, there are none so ignorant as those who do not want to learn the truth. Obviously, in the previous paragraph, and in almost every other instance of the word truth found within this book, it is meant the most accurate concept possible, or at least, an extremely accurate fact. For example, as unmistakably demonstrated in chapters 21 and 22 of this holiest of all holy scriptures, the only genuine holy book to have ever been composed, to be plainspoken, a final instruction sheet for humanity, it is undoubtedly true, that is, accurate, that a divinely instituted monarchy is the most favorable form of national governance, but that is not the absolute truth, which is the impersonal, never-changing foundation of all being. Whenever one hears such phrases as, I am earnestly searching for truth, this doctrine is true, or, Islam is the highest truth, one should take the term truth in a similar way, and that is, signifying the most accurate concepts possible, or at least, the most accurate concepts available, and not some person, or any object. Right pointing arrow. So, to put it succinctly, all truths, or relative concepts, even if they are very accurate, but the universal self alone is real, absolute truth. In the absence of both the belief, I am the body, and in the absence of the belief that I am not the body, what is left is what we really are. We don't need to define what we really are. We don't need to create a thought to tell us what we are. What we are is what truth is. Roger Castillo, Australian spiritual teacher, the 15th of July 2015. The significance of true philosophy is that it works, in the sense that its strength lies not in its words, but in the active practice of it. The identified man takes part in things and suffers. The unidentified man merely watches the spectacle. The identified man tries to understand truth, while the unidentified man experiences it. Ramesh S. Balsekar, Indian spiritual teacher. I am the truth. And the truth shall set you free. The Gospel according to John, 14:16 and 8:32. Attributed to Lord Jesus Christ. Obviously, the first part of this quotation contradicts the understanding of truth presented in this chapter. When people see some things as beautiful, other things become ugly. When people see some things as good, other things become bad. Being and non-being create each other. From Chapter 2 of Tao Te Ching. Laozi or Lao Tzu. If someone tries to convert you to some other system of belief, it's pointless. The more someone tries, the more you'll fight it, and irresistible force will meet a movable object, and goodbye, and nothing was gained. Robert Shunyamurti, Shubo. Abbot, Sat Yoga Institute and Ashram.